What's the craziest thing you've heard someone say after they thought they had hung up the phone? Business conference call. The other side had asked some pretty stupid questions, but was still poised to do $1 meter worth of business with us. Thinking the call had ended, one guy in the room started calling them idiots and talking about how what they were trying to do was never going to work, etc. They didn't say anything else, but we all heard the sound of the other side disconnecting, and they later reached out and said they were going to go in another direction. I work at a children's hospital, and anything serious like a code blue is called out hospital-wide over the loudspeakers by dialing a specific phone extension. There's been a few times where someone hit the hold button instead of end call, and the whole hospital gets to listen to the hold music until someone catches it. The worst/funniest though was a couple weeks ago. Every single employee, parent, and child in my world-renowned children's hospital heard this poor guy scream the F word when he realized he was still on. I was FaceTiming my parents shortly after I started dating my now wife. I'd had quite a dry spell and hadn't dated anyone for a couple years. So I mentioned we were dating on the call and they were happy for me. We ended it and I just put my phone down to grab something without ending the call. Apparently my mom did too, because after a few seconds I heard her say, well, I'm glad he's being intimate now. Awkward, but also I'm glad my mom is looking out for me. That stupid guy fell for it. This from a student's parent while I was excusing their kid from an assignment they missed because their grandmother just died. She hadn't. Still, the kid wouldn't pass the class under any circumstances because he was a complete knob. Once I talked to his parents I knew why, so he still failed the class even without the assignment. So I know one of us was a stupid guy, just not sure it's the same person they think it is. I have a not muted story. Webex. 500 people on the call, right when everyone was getting used to working remotely. Whoever set it up didn't mute the audience by default. The chaos was amazing. Dozens of people simultaneously unmuted and going about their lives. Dogs barking, kids crying, kitchen utensils clanging, the call leaders pleading for people to mute themselves. My favorite part was when they had things mostly quiet, about 5 people were still unmuted, including one guy who thought he was muted who yelled, "Jesus Christ people, mute your phones." Before realizing he was not on mute, they threw in the towel and ended the 1.5-hour meeting after 15 minutes. I had a job where I was in a position to write off a substantial phone bill, which the customer said was because her mother was dying overseas and she had dementia and needed to hear things in her voice to believe anything, including doctor's instructions. She was heartbroken and sobbing about how, if she had the kind of money to pay this phone bill, she would have just gone back to her country because the flight would have cost less. She was right about that. I wrote off the entirety of the phone bill. She cried like a jilted lover in a rom-com and said people like me are angels from God, etc. After I wished her a good evening and she thought the call was ended, she says to someone in a perfectly normal voice back, quote, "Well, that worked." Not a crazy story, but I had just finished talking to a client over the phone. We say our goodbyes. Then I hear her ask, "Are you wearing pants today?" I wasn't sure how to answer that, but I figure she was jokingly asking because everyone just started working from home due to COVID. I just replied yes. She then burst out laughing, trying to explaining that she thought she had already hung up and she was actually asking her husband that question. We laughed about it for about 3 minutes before we actually hung up. Not quite the same, but my parents told me a story about a long-term house guest that was problematic and difficult. When she finally walked out the door, apparently the relief was so great that my parents and older siblings started dancing around, declaring happily, "She's gone. She's gone," only to look up and see her standing in the doorway again. She had come back in to retrieve her umbrella by the door and had heard everything, and that's why for many years my parents would joke, "Don't forget your umbrella to departing guests." Something like this happened to me once. For a winter, I rented a room in a house with a couple that seemed really mismatched to me. One of them was way dumber than the other and maybe a little vaguely inappropriate with me, both of which I kind of called them out on a few times during my time there. I didn't really get how they could stay together and seemed so content with each other they never argued. When I was living there, had been together for 5+ years. and were engaged. When I left at the end of the season, I got to my car and realized I'd left one of my baking dishes there. Opened the front door and they were in the middle of a screaming match. No idea what it was about. Anyway, they broke up like 2 months later, and the dumb one got straight up married to another person within 6 months. Mine was a butt dial, not a failure to hang up. My parents are divorced and remarried. When I was 17, I lived with my mom and would see my dad on the weekends. I knew that my dad and stepmom were possibly trying to have kids, but they hadn't really said much to me about it. I got an accidental call from my dad while they were breaking the pregnancy news to my stepmom's parents. I answered and I could hear my step-grandmother saying, "Congratulations and we are so happy for you both." I listened for a couple minutes and was able to put together what the congratulations was about. My dad and stepmom told me about the pregnancy the next time I saw them, and I acted surprised. I didn't want to ruin it for them. I didn't tell them until years later that I had found out about my future brother from inside my dad's pocket. Last year, my job was monitoring call quality, so I would usually listen to phone agents in real time. In one instance, there was a caller that was simply not understanding what was being said. After the agent got off the phone with him, there was a 3-second window where I can still hear the agent scream, "Jesus, screw him." Didn't mark them for it as the call had technically ended at that point. Another time where someone placed a caller on hold, but because of how the phone system works I can hear the agent. Even if the caller is hearing music, she placed the caller on hold to call her sister and plan a vacation. Not sure if this fits. I sat in on a remote interview. We were in the conference room with 2 screens, one showing the interviewee and the other showing us. Nearing the end of the interview, I noticed my boss had seemed to develop an unusual neck spasm. He would face the screen, then suddenly look to the side, then face the screen again. At the end of the interview, as the candidate was exchanging "thank you" etc., I leant over and asked if my boss was okay. His answer was just loud enough to be picked up by the microphone. If you twist fast enough you can see your own ear. Needless to say, the job offer was not accepted. My mill had a new boss who hated her. She was about 3 years from retirement, and she felt like he was trying to push her out early, so she lose part of her pension etc. She asked me to check her answering machine while she was gone after her mother died, and let her know if anything important came in, and to water her plants. The 3rd day or so I'd been there was a message from this boss giving his condolences. Then you could hear the click where he thought he'd hung up, but must have placed the receiver just wrong and was still on the line. He ruthlessly made fun of her with his wife for the next 5 minutes before saying "oh, shh," and hanging up. She was at a really low point in her life, and I didn't have the heart to tell her or leave the message on the machine. It would have absolutely crushed her, but I did record it and then I deleted it from her machine. Then I called that guy and told him what I had, why I wasn't telling her right now, but absolutely would if needed in the future, and told him I'd better hear nothing but how wonderful work was going for her and how well she was treated until she retired. I told him I didn't even understand what a piece of she had to be to talk about someone like that behind their back, and especially at such a time in their life. And that's exactly what happened. She had a wonderful last few years and figured that her mother dying had opened him up to treat her kindly and with respect. That was 20 years ago, and I never told her and never will. I wouldn't want to ever take those last few years there away from her. I called a service provider who was supposed to order certificates of good standing from a state, and they were late in sending them over. They told me there was a delay at the state's office and gave me a new estimate. They forgot to hang up, and I heard them telling their coworker that they'd completely forgot to send in the time-sensitive request in the first place. Never use them again. I was working in a call center for some time, so I'd be calling around 30 to 40 people per day, which is exhausting work. There was this one particular call I still remember very clearly. It wasn't crazy, but the situation was rather unexpected. So, I'd be calling a woman about the end of her 30s. We'd have the usual chat, and she was readily replying to my questions, sometimes giggling and doing conversation outside the topic at hand. She was in a room with her daughter. When we ended the chat, I thanked her for her time and said my goodbye. A few seconds after that, she apparently thought I had already hung up and said to her daughter, "My goodness, He's got the most pleasant voice. I was smiling beams for the rest of the day and did enjoy the work much more for the rest of the week. My best friend at the time had been conducting a year-long prank on me in middle school when I was too stupid to know any better. She claimed to have a brother that had seen me on campus and had a crush on me. She did a very convincing voice impression of a guy and would hand off the phone to her brother when I would call sometimes. She was living with her grandparents, while her other siblings, 2 sisters that were real and the brother that wasn't real, lived with her mom. So when I went over to visit, I never saw him and never suspected a thing. One day I was talking to this fake brother and it was starting to get a little intimate. I was a romantic. What can I say? He abruptly tried to end the call and thought he had. When I heard my best friend say, "That was close. She almost got me," I proceeded to correct her and didn't talk to her for months. Later on, due to other events I won't get into, I suspected she was a lesbian who actually had a crush on me and was in denial. Don't know where she is now, and it's been years since I've heard from her. Not really crazy, but my grandparents would always call me from 2 different phones in their house, so we could all talk. When they'd get my voicemail and leave a message, instead of hanging up they'd talk to each other. Usually silly things like what's for dinner and stuff like that, but it always made me smile. I wish there had been a way to keep them back then.